You're watching Talking Point on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi. In Monterey, in California, is Leon Panetta. He's been there and done it all in terms of the U.S. government, whether it's in Congress, whether it's the chief of staff at the White House. He's also been the CIA director and the Secretary of Defense. Mr. Panetta, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
It's good to be with you.
Mr. Panetta, this undoubtedly China is going to be on everyone's horizon. It has been this year and will be again next year because of the belligerent nature that we've seen, across the board, across the globe. You would agree with that, wouldn't you?
Oh yeah, no question that dealing with China will be a major challenge facing the new administration here in America.
And how do you see its behavior, especially in the last year, since, of course, the pandemic surfaced? Since then, whether it's, the Senkakus in Japan, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, across Taiwan. Then we had on the northern borders with the India and Tibet in Ladakh as well. Extremely belligerent atmosphere. The Australians who are facing caution as well. Why do you see China behaving the way it does now? Does it feel that its rightful place in the world is being denied to it?
Well, my concern is that I think, the Trump administration kind of conveyed a signal that the United States was going to be slowly withdrawing from the rest of the world to an America First kind of approach. And I think what happened is the United States left a vacuum that has been filled by Russia and by China. And China, obviously, sensing that the United States would not be competitive with them, whether it was with trade or in other areas, has been very aggressive at moving into other opportunities with countries. They just worked out a trade agreement with the ASEAN countries, Asian countries. That was a trade deal that the United States had completed, and then President Trump walked away from that, gave China the opportunity to go in and build new trade agreements there. They have continued to be very ambitious diplomatically, moving into a number of countries, providing aid, building ports, providing assistance of one kind or another. They've been very aggressive on the military side, again with the South China Sea, not only militarizing the islands there, but also being very tough on Hong Kong, being tough on Taiwan, and obviously being aggressive towards India as well, particularly along your border areas. So we have a China that has been very assertive, and I think they've taken advantage of a vacuum left by the absence of United States leadership.
And that vacuum, would you say, had also something to do with the clashes on the north of India in Ladakh, where over 20 Indian soldiers died, unknown number of Chinese as well. Why do you see that having been done in terms of the Chinese Communist Party? Is it also sending a signal to other smaller countries in the region?
I think just as we saw Russia go into the Crimea and into the Ukraine, sensing that nobody was going to confront them and that they would get away with that. I think similarly, they've been very aggressive along your border areas. Normally, that's an area that, generally the Chinese have not deliberately been as aggressive as they've been, recognizing that the world community, I think, would support India in any kind of direct confrontation. I think sensing that the United States, might not be there and would not join in stopping China they probably have been more aggressive in terms of what they've done with India. And I think you can see that President Xi has been much bolder at asserting the power of China, not just in India, but elsewhere in the world as well.
And do you think they were surprised by the way India behaved, at least?
I don't think there's any question that, India had to respond. You responded in a way that is important to protecting your national security and your interests. And I think because of your bold response, it sent a signal that it was not going to be something that was going to be ignored by India. And that's important to do. You've got to make clear to China that they do not have a right to invade your sovereignty.
Behave from a position of strength in various dimensions. Now, President-elect Biden, of course, if I go back in time, I think it would have been, 2009, when as Vice President Biden, he swore you in as the CIA director at Langley. And you are, of course, a friend of his, colleague in many senses for so many decades. How do you see President-elect Biden and the administration dealing with China, especially since domestic policy will also occupy a huge amount of his time?
I think the difference is going to be that Joe Biden very much believes that the United States has to assert world leadership and that we have to assert that leadership by building and strengthening our alliances with our allies throughout the world. That's a fundamental difference from the approach that was taken during the last 4 years. He feels very strongly that it is important, in order to protect our own national security, that the United States be present in the world, takes the position that, the threats that we face from our adversaries, whether it's China, whether it's Russia, whether it's North Korea, whether it's Iran, that it's important for the world community to come together and to make clear that we are going to stand against anything that violates international law and international values. And I think that's true with India. I mean, India has been an ally for a long time. We have had great relationships as director of the CIA. I had a very good relationship with my counterparts in India. The same is true when I was Secretary of Defense. We worked together on security issues together. And I think that Joe Biden will do the same. We recognize that India is a very important ally in that region. It's a region in which we're dealing with Afghanistan, we're dealing with Pakistan, we're dealing with China. It is critical that the United States and India maintain a strong alliance. And I think Joe Biden will do that.
Alliance raises a lot of prickly hair here in Delhi when you talk about it in terms of the U.S., but the partnership definitely has moved, and a lot of it because of China. If you've seen the 2+2, which took place, the last foundational agreement, BECA, that was signed. We've seen joint exercises with your carrier groups as well. A lot of that, the Quad, which is manifested in the maritime dimension by the Malabar and Australia coming back. China is driving a lot of that. Do you see President Biden keeping up the strong focus in terms of alliances? Yes, Europe, he will go back. NATO will be strengthened, I presume. But in terms of the forces that are counterbalancing or pushing back or countering or forces in terms of China, do you see that also being kept up?
I do. I think, look, we're facing a lot of flashpoints in the world. The United States is facing a dangerous world, not only in the Middle East, not only with regards to terrorism, which is a threat that India constantly faces as well, We're facing the challenge from Iran. We're facing the challenge from North Korea, which is now developing more nuclear weapons and their missile capability. We're facing the threat from China and both their investments in military equipment and advanced technology. We're facing the threat from Russia. We're in a new period really a new chapter of the Cold War with Russia at the present time. We're facing the threat of cyber attacks, and I'm sure India is aware of that as well. Having your technological capability, you understand that cyber can be the battlefield of the future. So there are a number of threats that we're facing around the world. The United States can't deal with these threats alone. What it has to do is build alliances and strengthen those alliances. In Europe, of course, in dealing with Russia, it's NATO. In the Middle East, it's important to have a strong alliance with moderate Arab countries and with Israel. In dealing with China, I think it's incredibly important to have the ASEAN countries working as a partnership, and I think it's particularly important to have that partnership with India as well. So as we look at the various threats that are out there in the world, I think what is necessary is for responsible countries that recognize the importance of protecting their security and protecting their values have to come together. If there's one thing that China hates, if there's one thing that Russia hates, it's alliances. It is partnerships of countries working together to confront them. They don't join that kind of relationship. They don't operate that way. And so it's very important to show them that when it comes to our interests, our national interests, when it comes to our values, when it comes to protecting the kinds of things that we think are important, the freedom of our people, that we're going to stand together.
And this standing together, we've seen the Quad having a reaction from Beijing, say on that front. But do you see any of the efforts, even if they are happening collectively in any dimension, actually making the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, Beijing, change their behavior? Because it seems like they don't care what the rest of the world is doing.
Well, I think that if it is clear that countries are not just going to stand back and allow them to take advantage of them, then I think they'll pay attention. I remember sitting down with President Xi, and at the time he was very concerned because as Secretary of Defense, the president had agreed that we were going to rebalance and expand our naval power in the Pacific. And President Xi, when I met with him, his first objection, his first criticism was that we were expanding our forces in the Pacific. And I said to him, the United States is a Pacific power, just as China is. And we have some common issues that we're dealing with, that are concerned about. We're worried about North Korea. We are worried about trade. We are worried about freedom of the seas. We're worried about other issues. We ought to be working together to deal with those issues. And it was interesting that, when I indicated that we were going to stand by the increased forces in the Pacific, we were going to continue to work with our ASEAN countries. We were going to continue to work with South Korea, with Japan, with Australia, and made very clear that we're not going to back off. He said something that I thought was important. He said, well, ultimately, the most important thing is that we all seek peace and prosperity. I said, you're right. That is the goal that we all want to achieve. But to do that, we really have to work together, not against each other.
Interesting that you're bringing that up, because some analysts would say that it was China which initially offered demilitarization in the Indo-Pacific, and it was President Obama not accepting that has set them on this path. But ASEAN, you know how China drives a wedge there because of how the region operates. And
That's right.
so it's being able to find the weakest link. Uh, when President-elect Biden, now already there seems to be a shift in at least in the terminology, and whether that's important or not can be debated. Indo-Pacific was a concept that has been bandied a lot, but at least twice already, President Biden has been going back to the Asia-Pacific. Is that any indication of how he's, because you have to at least diplomatically still talk with China in spite of pushing back against them?
Well, look, I think the most important thing is that when you talk with China, you have to talk from a position of strength. Otherwise, it's not worth talking to China. And you have to make clear that there are certain lines you're not going to allow China to cross. And if you make that clear, and if you show your power, and if you stand strong, then I think it gives you better leverage in having a dialogue with China, because they will then recognize your strength, and you'll be able then to try to work out solutions to other issues. That's the basis of negotiation. You have to negotiate from strength. And if you do that, then I think you should keep open a line of dialogue with China. I mean, we should be talking about trade. We should be talking about cyber. We should be talking about other issues that are critical to us. But we also have to make very clear that we will not accept their aggressiveness, military or otherwise, invading and trying to take over markets and take over other countries, really, by virtue of their funding and their efforts to kind of dominate these countries. Once they get in economically, they try to ultimately dominate these countries. That's not acceptable. These countries have to remain independent. They've got to make decisions on their own. And if China allows that to happen, then we can have a dialogue. But if China continues to assert its military aggressiveness, if they continue to try to militarize the South China Sea, if they continue to try to dominate some of these countries in the ASEAN region, then I think the United States and other countries are going to have to be much tougher in dealing with China.
When you're saying not acceptable, you talked about terrorism and cooperation between India and the U.S. and other countries as well. Now, Pakistan is an area where both you and he have vast experience. I mean, his even goes back to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when he headed that before he became vice president. You both have traveled so extensively. You're both in the Situation Room when Operation Geronimo happened, Abbottabad. Will Pakistan, if is still very crucial because of the Afghanistan peace process, but in terms of terrorism, will President-elect Biden be able to tighten the screws further on Pakistan? Because we all know how terrorist groups are used as sponsors of foreign policy.
Look, as I said, one of the threats that we are continuing to deal with is the threat from terrorism.
Yep.
And we experienced that obviously with the 9/11 attack, and we have never forgotten what happened on that day. And the result is we went to war against terrorists. And we went after their leadership. And it was, as you point out, oftentimes we would continue to urge Pakistan to cooperate with us in efforts to go after these terrorists. And while on one hand, they would say they were concerned about this, on the other hand, they would also work with terrorist groups. And in dealing with India, for example, they were working with terrorist groups that were responsible for some of the attacks that took place in India. So it has to be made clear to Pakistan that, we're prepared to work with them, but we will work with them only if they do not continue to cooperate with terrorist groups and create instability in that region. That has to be a clear message. We've given that message before. Too often they've ignored it. But I think it's important for Pakistan to understand that if they want to be a partner in that region, that they cannot engage with terrorism.
And going a little bit further now to Afghanistan and the peace process, there talks there have been stopped till the 5th of January. They're taking a break while both sides look at how to move further. But Pakistan's role there and what's happened in the last few weeks or the month, where President Trump announced that drawdown to 2,500 by the 15th of January, without the Taliban necessarily following any of the conditions that were laid out in the Doha Declaration. How do you see the Afghan peace process moving?
Well, I was very concerned about what President Trump did in reducing our presence in Afghanistan and getting nothing in return. I don't, look, I understand.
Except possibly putting the Biden administration in a tighter spot.
That's true. I mean, look, I understand that there's a lot of frustration with a war that's gone on as long as we've been in Afghanistan. It's the longest war we've been involved with. And we have lost lives, and there are a lot of innocent lives that have been lost as well. But the purpose of that was to make sure that Afghanistan would never become a basis for terrorism. And if we should walk away from there and the Taliban then take control of Afghanistan, then we are essentially creating a threat not only in the region, but against our own country from terrorism. That's unacceptable. And so for that reason, are we willing to negotiate? Of course, we should negotiate and try to see if there are ways to try to achieve some kind of consensus there. But we ought not to simply withdraw our presence, our military presence there, without being assured that there are conditions that they're prepared to meet. And I think that isn't the case right now. And for that reason, I think that the Biden administration, yes, they'll try to negotiate, but I think it's going to be very clear that the United States is not simply going to walk away from Afghanistan and allow that country to become a base for terrorism again.
And talking about negotiation, all indications are that there will be negotiations with Iran as well. I mean, many people are calling it the JCPOA 2.0 if it happens. How do you see because that is another region where the U.S. is so involved in, and in terms of developments with Saudi Arabia, what is expected from Congress and the Biden administration against the Saudi regime, the assassination of the nuclear scientist in Iran, the so-called meeting that never took place between Benjamin Netanyahu and the Crown Prince. And so there's a lot which will also get the president-elect's focus in that region.
Well, I think, President Biden is someone who thinks that it was a mistake, I'm sure, for President Trump to walk away from the nuclear agreement. There are criticisms about that agreement. I understand some I share. But at the same time, it was working effectively to limit Iran from enriching additional nuclear fuel. When Trump walked away from it, it basically gave Iran the license to continue to enrich nuclear fuel, which they've done. The situation with Iran is much more volatile in terms of a possibility of war in that region. We've seen exchanges. We've seen what's happened. I think what the Biden administration wants to do is to resurrect the alliance that we've had with France, with Great Britain, with Germany, with Russia, and China that were involved in the negotiations of the agreement with Iran, to work with them to determine whether or not we can open up new negotiations with Iran. But there have to be preconditions to that as well. Iran has to return to the limits that they agreed to under the terms of that agreement. I think Iran also has to be willing to talk about what they're doing with missile development, what they're doing with support for terrorism. So there are some conditions that have to be in place in order for us to ultimately be able to sit down and negotiate. I think negotiations are in the interest not just of the United States, but also in the interest of Iran. But we have to test whether or not they're going to be willing to accept some of those conditions.
Mr. Leon Panetta, I could have gone on forever picking your brain and your experience, but I'll cut this conversation short here. Thank you so much for your time and your insights.
Well, thank you very much, and my very best to you and to all of my colleagues in India. I always enjoyed my relationship with India, enjoyed going to New Delhi and visiting your great country. I hope I can do it again someday. And in the meantime, my best wishes to all of you for a peaceful new year.
It was a pleasure hosting you, Mr. Panetta, and it'll be on this show, and it'll be a pleasure to host you again in this country. Thank you again.
Great. Good to talk to you.
And just a reminder to our viewers, you can get onto our website if you like to support our kind of journalism. Do follow our social media handles on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You've been watching Talking Point on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.